Let's talk more about this, and to put this more into perspective, let's bring in Joseph Williams. He's a former senior editor at U.S. News and World Report. Welcome to the program, Joseph. Good to see you. Sorry under these circumstances.
That's crazy.
Let's talk a bit about, I think Jim touched upon it a bit. You saw it in the face of the people he interviewed. The emotional toll on this. I can see some attorney 10 years from now, were you affected by the train? You know, you may be subject to a huge outpouring of financial aid. This could be a long-term problem.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, there have been several lawsuits that have been brought against Norfolk Southern already, and the trains are just barely being cleared from the tracks. And many of them are blaming Norfolk Southern for launching a burn that they said would prevent an explosion, but almost made things worse, and B, some serious emotional distress on residents who were forced to flee their homes in the middle of the night, sometimes with barely what they owned. And this is not a wealthy community. So many of these folks have had to live in shelters, have had to find places to live with relatives that are kind of far flung. It's a really serious problem if you live in East Palestine and don't have a lot of money to escape to some place that you think is safe. And now they're telling you that things are safe, but you have to run the risk of coming back to a place that could make you sick.
You know, you and I have both covered disasters like this that kind of unfold over a period of days, weeks, even months. What about the economic impact for local businesses, both short and long term? I mean, you look at that explosion, you have to wonder, you know, what were they thinking?
That's a question they're going to be forced to ask in court, I'm pretty sure. But even if we're talking about short-term impact, your reporter mentioned that there are some businesses that had to close overnight and that some residents are coming back to find even the toxic smell is still there. When they reopen those businesses, some paid to have them professionally cleaned. Is that going to be enough to have people return and eat and shop and do the things that brought these businesses their own income? It's an open question, mainly because the crisis is still ongoing. And even after the crisis, I mean, many people would remember the town 3 Mile Island. That still rings very heavy in the national lexicon, and you would not be alone if you decided not to spend the night there or spend any food there, or buy any food rather. So the long-term impacts we're only beginning to now kind of come to grips with, but it's certain that it's going to last for years, if not longer.
You know, one thing that kind of played out from my perspective, it took a while for this to get the attention of the nation and for people to react to this. Why do you think that was?
A couple of things. I mean, first is that East Palestine is kind of a small town. If this had happened in maybe Shaker Heights, let's say, or Washington, D.C., in fact, it probably would have been a much, much bigger story. And it seems that these train derailments are fairly common. We had 2,000 of them last year, some 800 involving toxic chemicals, and only a small fraction of those actually resulted in a disaster type scenario where you either had an explosion or a release of toxic chemicals. So those two factors, the fact that it's in a small town and that you're dealing with a very toxic situation that didn't seem immediately toxic right away, probably kept the press from getting there and paying attention to this as a bigger national story, coupled with the fact that the administration really seemed to be caught flat-footed here with this particular incident.
So what we're seeing here, you talked about the 2,000 others. I mean, this is going to have significant local impact for a long time moving forward. There are a lot of concerns about the brakes on that train as well as the antiquated infrastructure, and there are towns all over the United States that could be dealing with the same kind of thing.
That's exactly right. And if you want to take an even larger view of this, there's a through line that runs through the barely missed rail strike in December, where the administration compelled rail workers to go back to work, and this very accident. Over the course of the last 5-6 years or so, Norfolk Southern has laid off thousands of workers trying to adopt a just-in-time rail schedule where the trains are going to move whether people think they're ready or not, because this precision timing gets goods there more cheaply. It allows the railroad to rack up more profits, because their biggest expense is personnel. So you couple that with the fact that these train operators are running without sick days, without the necessary backup, and without the kind of support that they traditionally had, just because the company wanted to make more profits. Norfolk Southern made some $3 billion in profits last year. So what they're handing out to Palestine residents is basically money they'd find in a sofa cushion over the long haul, but they will be forced to pay a larger price. The federal government now has to pay attention because this is a crisis that can no longer be ignored, and rail safety has to be job one for Pete Buttigieg when he goes back to Washington.
Yeah, indeed. I think a lot of people are wondering how he's going to move forward on this. But let's go back to Norfolk Southern as well. Their plans for cleanup, compensation, and the fact they must now attend these very heated local meetings. I mean, you have to worry about their safety, but how are they going to attack this cleanup and compensation?
Well, they have to attack it one resident of Palestine, Ohio at a time. I mean, there's a reason why they avoided these meetings in the past, mainly because they knew they would get a very hostile confrontational reaction, as I would probably be angry if I had some rail executive show up at a meeting and try to explain why his train crashed and I had to flee my home. So certainly it's a measure of damage control of a sort, and how well they will do in that damage control depends on how well they're able to plausibly explain what happened and make sure that they make it right for these citizens of Ohio. You're absolutely right. There are lots of towns like this. East Palestine itself had a rail yard. So that's one of the reasons why this strikes so deeply at them, is that they were part of that infrastructure.
Indeed. Joseph Williams, thank you again. We appreciate your insight, my friend.
My pleasure.